area for about 10 years before and after the time that I spent in Chiapas. So it really feels like I'm home, which is fantastic. And so I thank you all for being here. Thank you, Charlotte, for moderating. And it's such a pleasure to be here with two women who have been such long-term, incredible voices in this struggle. So the theme of the panel today is very close to my heart, because I feel like the women throughout history have played such an important role in movements, including anti-capitalist movements, but all sorts of movements, organizations, grassroots formations, and have often, played that backbone role, but not been the ones kind of in the forefront. I see a lot of head nodding. I think, it's probably, how many people have been familiar with that kind of dynamic in your own life? Fair number of us, right? And so I think in a lot of ways our movements are collectively, like, we get that, we're moving in the right direction, but it's still sort of a timeless and universal kind of question. So when I ended up in Chiapas, in southern Mexico, in the late 1990s, in response to a call from the Zapatistas for human rights observers, I ended up staying 6 years when I planned just to be there for a few weeks or a few months, because not only was it such a compelling social movement, but at that time the role of women's role within the movement, on the one hand, they had already achieved these incredible sort of transformations, and at the same time the process was still in this really interesting kind of moment of evolution, and I felt like history was kind of unfolding before my eyes, and how could I not kind of stay and be part of it in some way. So I worked for about 6 years with women's collectives, which actually what Selma was just talking about, that just process of working together, investing those resources back into the community is very similar to the women's collectives that I was working with. And then at the tail end of that, did a project of collecting the women's stories for themselves. They wanted to record their own stories and use that as a tool of organizing and education. And then at the tail end of that, asked me to, they kind of said, we really want to share these stories with women from around the world, with people from around the world. So, would you like to do something like this for an outside audience? And so that's where, this book, Compañeras, came from. To do just a really, I'm sort of, already jumped in, but I'm sort of figure a fair number of people here are familiar with the Zapatista movement, but because I have already launched in, can I just see a show of hands? Who here has heard of / considers themselves somewhat familiar with the Zapatista movement? Okay, all right, so most people. So just like super 2-sentence background, role of indigenous movement, largely indigenous in southern Mexico, Chiapas. Historically came out of the history of indigenous resistance, but also the Mexican Revolution, carried the sort of banner of Tierra y Libertad, land and freedom, but also really brought that analysis into the late 20th century. So when they had their very brief armed uprising in 1994, they chose January 1st, 1994, because it was the day that NAFTA went into effect. So this movement has always located neoliberalism as the kind of current stage of global capitalism that is what the kind of big picture system that we need to address. And that, a lot of that legacy goes back to colonialism and the contradictions that exist. I'm sorry? Yeah. Those contradictions that exist in Chiapas are really very visible to this day. So, but the Zapatista movement has taken on capitalism in a number of different ways. So there's this big picture, understanding global capitalism as kind of the enemy, and that, that men, women, peasants, indigenous people, we can't separate their liberation from that larger system, and have, one of the strategies they've used is kind of networking with people around the world. They helped to plant the seeds of the anti-globalization movement in the late 90s. And then at the sort of local and regional level, they've created this real alternative. So in their project of indigenous autonomy, which includes their own community self-governance, includes their own education and healthcare, it includes these economic structures which are based on the collective well-being and cooperation as opposed to generating profit. So in their own practice are kind of, creating this very viable alternative to what global capitalism looks like. And then in their sort of interpersonal lives, like, women have also achieved an incredible level of transformation in their own selves, in their families, in their communities, in terms of the family dynamics, in terms of choosing who they marry, in terms of how many children they have, in terms of domestic violence, and also the roles that they play in all these different levels of the movement, as political leaders, as military leaders, in the construction of health and educational alternatives. So I just wanted to read actually a quick story from the book that I think highlights a little bit of this. It's a woman named Isabel, and so folks might know that before 1994, the Zapatista movement was clandestine for about 10 years, so this is in that time period. Isabel was one of the first women to join the EZLN. In 1984, when she was 14 years old, she left home to join the rebel army. During the uprising 10 years later, Isabel led a battalion of troops as a captain. She stayed in the Zapatista army for another 10 years after that, and stepped down in 2003, having spent almost 2 decades of her life as a Zapatista soldier and military leader. When I first met Isabel, she was still a military commander and quite an intimidating figure. Exuding a tremendous air of authority, she didn't smile often or talk much. When I interviewed Isabel in 2008, she still wore pants and boots, and she still carried herself with that same air of authority, but she smiled more readily and spoke more openly. I was about 8 or 9 years old, she said, when I really began to think about my surroundings. I was already doing all a mother's work within my family. I began doing that work when I was very young, because my mother is a peasant woman, and she works in the fields. Since I'm the oldest daughter, well, in our villages, a lot of responsibility falls on the shoulders of the oldest daughter. I was looking after my younger brothers and sisters, cleaning the house, and taking care of the animals. When I was invited to join the organization, I said to myself, I want to learn more and to move forward, but there's always a but, right? You have to leave everything behind. Your family, your work, community life, everything. I was 14 years old. I wanted to better myself as a person, but it was very painful. It was hard to leave all that behind. I accepted this change because I had seen the suffering of all the women around me. My mother, my sisters, my aunts, my grandmothers. I saw how unfair their lives were. So I thought to myself, why not now? At 14 years old, why not commit myself to doing something for this organization called the EZLN? So that was just one woman's sort of process and choice. She refers a little bit to some of the conditions that women faced that were, ways that these issues were kind of interconnected. And then women like Isabel went on to create the space for women in the villages, in the Zapatista army, to really start demanding their rights and implementing that. And the next little thing is a quote I wanted to read from her about how they came up with the Revolutionary Women's Law, which became kind of a guiding framework for women's rights within Zapatista territory. We gave women the space to talk, to express their feelings, and how they wanted to change all this. Life in the family, with their husbands, with their children. That was where the ideas came from. If things are this bad, we asked ourselves, why not change it? Change men's ideas as well, and find a way, as an organization, to turn these ideas into a law. And that's how the Women's Revolutionary Law was born. Talking, venting, analyzing. It's not something from outside. It came from our own ideas, our experience in our families and communities, with our parents, our husbands, and our children. So I think that just kind of captures a little bit this relationship where the ways that we transform our own lives and our own communities are so connected to the bigger picture vision that we have of changing capitalism, of changing the world. And but one of the Zapatista women leaders named Comandante Esther was the first indigenous woman to ever speak to the Mexican Congress, and a very well-known kind of part of her speech, this is 2001, she said, "We're oppressed 3 times over, because we're women, because we're poor, and because we're indigenous." And I think just that connection that she was making is, you know, something that women in Mexico, around the world, kind of face, and why we can't sort of separate out these different struggles. So this might be a representation of a generational shift. Like Selma said, there's a lot more to say. I'm happy to share it. I would give you my email. I won't give you my phone number. But, or you could buy the book. It's Stephen, I believe, from PM Press just came by with a couple copies of both books. This one as well, which sounds phenomenal. And you know, they're also at the PM table. So the last connection I wanted to make, just in terms of that sort of in our lives, the changes that we're making, and in that sort of big picture, is the organization that I worked at for the last 5 years is called Make the Road New York, and has some of that same philosophy of, you know, comes from this Chilean poem of we make the road by walking, but the sense of there is a world of justice and dignity out there, and we are going to get there, but we have to create it ourselves. And, you know, some transformations are kind of cataclysmic and amazing, and then some take a long time. And so I'll leave it at that, and I'm very excited to hear what, you know, the panelists and I will discuss, questions and responses from you guys as well. Thank you, Charlotte.